The next topic we're going to explore is observable behaviours and how we collect evidence towards those. Ian, we often hear the term observable behaviours, and when it comes to a technical qualification such as painting or decorating or a trade, quite often the practical checklists, an assessor can say that a student did X, meeting certain requirements. It becomes more difficult when we're talking about soft skills such as communication. What have you seen and what evidence do you expect to see from an RTO and an assessor actually collecting or completing a practical assessment against those soft skills such as communication?
The assessment tools need to be designed to include evidence criteria, and this enables a valid judgment of meeting the required quality and quantity of performance. These are the assessment decision-making rules. These evidence criteria provide certain benchmarks that inform what is required as a response from the student. Now, it could be a word count, as we've talked about previously, 100 to 200 words. In some cases, it identifies the number of occasions a task needs to be performed. In the hospitality area, it refers to having 40 service periods as part of the workplace arrangements. So there are criteria and benchmarks that need to be included that meet the requirements of the training package. Observable behaviours will generally be evidenced and recorded via some form of assessment tool where the assessor needs to watch the student perform the actual task and then make their judgment of competence. Referring to the example that you provided about the soft skills versus the technical skills, when developing an observation checklist to observe a learner, painting an assessor that is skilled and experienced with current industry skills would develop an observation checklist that outlines the things that they would expect to see in conducting that task, in setting it up and right through to completing the task and packing up and cleaning up the process. So they're as you mentioned, the technical skills, the tasks that can be identified through a checklist. The ones that you mentioned a little bit more difficult to identify in that process would be the soft skills, the customer skills, the communication skills that are often appear as a requirement in a training package. So when developing an observation checklist to assess soft skills, such as communication, the assessor needs to consider when those skills would be used during the observation. They would need to create an assessment task around those skills. This identifies the context of the task that's to be demonstrated. For example, with communication, the assessment would need to allow the learner to demonstrate communicating with another person. So the instructions, the conditions of assessment, and the tasks should allow this to occur. The observation checklist should guide the assessor to consider those behaviours. And this is to record the behaviours observed and then make a judgment as to whether or not that's a satisfactory response or demonstration of skill from that learner. And this evidence may also be supplemented by evidence from a third party, from a supervisor in a workplace or some other form of observation that can strengthen and reinforce what the actual assessors observed and noted on their observation checklist.
So when we're looking at these observation checklists, is it okay just to reproduce the performance criteria as things that are going to be reviewed?
The performance criteria list in detail all the elements that are required to be demonstrated. But at audit, the thing that I find lacking is any sort of supporting notation or detail of the task that was performed, where it was performed, what the actual task involved, and the assessor's notation as to what they actually observed, other than a sheet that has a bunch of tick boxes for them to identify. And the other thing that I often find at audit is the checklist might be 1, 2, possibly 3 pages long, and it's not a realistic a reliable form of evidence that the student, in the time that was allowed, has actually completed all those particular tasks. So I'm not saying that they didn't complete them, but the evidence that's presented is not reliable without some additional form of notation that explains how they're able to complete that task under those conditions.
It's sometimes understood that the training package is the benchmark, and therefore there's a little confusion about other references to benchmarks. What do you mean by assessment benchmarks?
Assessment task benchmarks provide guidance that are specific to the assessment tasks that have been undertaken by students, and the purpose of those benchmarks is to assist in the reviewing of assessment evidence to ensure that there's consistent outcomes that sufficiently address the training package requirements. And as such, they define the required quality and standards of performance. And this may also include additional industry requirements that are not explicitly stated in the training package. For example, if the student is required to perform a task in accordance with particular industry requirements.
So they can be quite nuanced to the cohort and the conditions of that assessment. Is that right?
Yes, certainly, and particularly in relation to perhaps the environment in which the student is actually undertaking the assessment as well. So, for example, they may be required to complete the task in accordance with an organisation's policies and procedures. So, yes, you're quite correct there. So they are more than just the training package. They actually relate specifically to the assessment tasks and the performance required in relation to those assessment tasks.
And where you have multiple assessors for a particular qualification or unit, whatever, cluster, the benchmark, I understand, can provide a point of consistency as well and point of reference for them. Often though, courses only have one cohort and only have one assessor. In those situations, do they need benchmarks?
Yes, we would suggest that there should be benchmarks, regardless of however many assessors an organisation has. The benchmark defines, as I mentioned, the standard of performance, which means that when the assessor is reviewing assessment evidence presented by different students, the assessor to some extent also needs to be able to justify why one student was determined competent and why another student was perhaps determined not competent. And the way, I guess, to be able to justify that is by reference to the actual benchmark. This also means that if the student asks questions or appeals the assessment decision, the assessor is able to refer to the benchmark and to be able to clearly explain to the student why their response or why their assessment evidence has been determined as not competent with reference to the requirements specified in the benchmark.
Thank you.
And it's also difficult to validate your assessments if you don't know where the goals are. So it assists that process of internal review.